Last time, we left off trying to count the different federal agencies. The number can seem comically large, but the number of social problems we face is large too, though not so comical. Suspicion and even hatred of government has been a persistent phenomenon over the entire course of American history, especially if government is perceived to be helping despised persons and groups, as in the case of the Freedmen's Bureau. This paranoid style in American politics, as the historian Richard Heilbroner called it, often aims today to destroy the network of agencies that the people, through their elected representatives, have erected over the last century. Pictured here is Steve Bannon, former advisor to President Trump. Bannon has advocated the deconstruction of the administrative state, and by this he does not mean analyzing it in the way a literary critic might deconstruct a novel. But insofar as deconstruction does involve analysis and understanding, we will be engaged in deconstructing the administrative state too, not to destroy, but to grasp. Grant that federal agencies have largely been effective in promoting justice and prosperity, two of the values stated in the preamble to the Constitution. But what about liberty? Doesn't government always and necessarily infringe on liberty? Isn't government the hideous monster whose devouring jaws spare neither sex nor age, nor high nor low, nor sacred nor profane? This is the language of the Federalist No. 33, cited by the dissenters in the Affordable Care Act case, National Federation of Independent Business versus Sibelius. In the dissenters' view, forcing people to buy health insurance is tyranny, just as much as forcing them to, pay taxes. But we do pay taxes and have to buy auto insurance and drive cars with windshields and so on. In administrative law, our focus is legal, but the legal object we study is shaped by normative beliefs that are never far from the service. By the way, the majority in the ACA case upheld the constitutionality of the individual mandate because it was a tax. Congress thought that justice and the general welfare justified the setback to liberty that the ACA involves, and Congress delegated discretion to the Secretary of Health and Human Services to fine-tune this balance. So the officials at DHHS are looking out for our interests, but who is supervising DHHS? In other words, who's minding the minders? We, the people, did not choose Kathleen Sibelius. There are huge social problems to be dealt with, and to address them, we, the people, have delegated immense power to the federal sovereign. But have we created a monster that threatens to devour our liberty? Or has the federal sovereign been designed in a way that automatically limits the tendency of centralized, coercive power to aggrandize itself? The framers of our Constitution took the lesson of the French theorist Montesquieu. The survival of liberty depends upon dividing up the powers of government according to its different types. Montesquieu wrote, "When legislative power is united with executive power in a single body, there is no liberty, nor is there liberty if the power of judging is not separate from the legislative power and from executive power." James Madison, writing in the Federalist No. 47, asserted that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. Taking Madison's proposition at face value, we would suppose that administrative agencies become tyrannical to the extent that they unite these three types of power: legislative, executive, and judicial. We will see that administrative agencies, in fact, often possess all three types of power. Are they then tyrannical by definition? The U.S. Constitution sets up what is called a presidential system, as contrasted to a parliamentary system. In a presidential system, the chief executive stands in a horizontal relation to the legislature. By contrast, in a parliamentary system, the leader of the dominant party or coalition in the legislature is the chief executive. As Walter Bagehot, founding editor of The Economist, wrote, "The nearly complete fusion of the executive and the legislature is the efficient secret and characteristic merit of the English Constitution." The United Kingdom is a parliamentary system. Well, technically a constitutional monarchy, but leave that aside. The monarch has for well over a century had no more than a ceremonial role. In light of the permanent condition of divided government in a presidential system, the efficiency and flexibility of a parliamentary system can be attractive. Notwithstanding Montesquieu and Madison, political scientists have not found parliamentary systems to be especially prone to tyranny, nor, for that matter, that presidential systems are immune to tyranny. Does our Constitution rest on a false premise? That is a normative question. From a legal and descriptive point of view, there is no question that ours is a presidential system and will remain so. So from e pluribus unum, which means from many one, we go to the separation of powers at the federal level. And this separation is superimposed above a federal system of what are now 50 states, each with a degree of internal sovereignty. So governmental power is widely dispersed in our nation. This dispersion itself assures that there are checks and balances between different centers of power. What does the idea of separating types of power and concentrating them to certain branches while denying them to others achieve, other than a loss of efficiency? Separation of powers is not the same as mere diffusion of powers. The Montesquieu Madison idea is not merely to cut the sovereign power into smaller chunks. If that were the idea, then it would not matter whether the chunks exercise two or three of all three of the identified types of power: legislative, executive, and judicial. You might have a green branch, a red branch, and a yellow branch, and even a blue and an orange branch, each having a part of each of the total of the three types of power. In ancient Rome, some gladiators were equipped with a sword and a shield, while others were equipped with a trident and a net. This was both a dispersion of powers and a separation. But why not let a gladiator have a choice of weapons, or issue them the same weapons? Today, we make teams and players take turns in some games. But what kind of game is it where one team always gets to kick the ball and the other team never can? This was not a difficulty as far as the Montesquieu Madison separation of powers theory was concerned. Article 1 of the Constitution gives all the legislative power to a Congress, and by implication, no legislative power to the President or the courts. The vesting of all legislative power is the starting point. But can Congress, by legislation, transfer or delegate any of its power to another branch or to an agency? We turn now to some early decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court for guidance. The very first Congress gave the President the power to appoint an officer to estimate import duties. Imposing any duties at all requires initiative by Congress, but Congress met rarely, and convening Congress was not easy in the 18th and early 19th century. At the time of the founding, it would have been easier to convene in London than in Philadelphia. In the case of the brig Aurora, Congress had imposed retaliatory tariffs on British imports. These hurt Americans about as much as they did the British, so Congress empowered the president to end the tariffs on a foreign nation's exports the moment he found that that nation had ceased to violate the neutral commerce of the United States. British warships had been boarding U.S. shipping on the high seas, and the tariffs were slapped on British goods in retaliation. But Congress wanted the tariffs to stop as soon as possible once Britain started respecting us. Congress itself could lift the embargo only by legislating, but to legislate, Congress had to be in session. So to assure a quick end to the tariffs, Congress delegated the power to lift the tariffs to the president. But if repealing a tariff is an exercise of legislative power, how could the president do what Congress felt itself unable to do quickly without exercising the legislative power himself, contrary to Article 1? The court in the Brig Aurora held that, in short, the president's lifting the embargo was not an exercise of delegated legislative power, and so the statute that granted him the power to lift the embargo did not violate Article 1. The president's role was simply the executive one of finding a fact and acting accordingly under Congress's statutory directive. Tariffs and trade wars were the backdrop of the next case in this line. In Field v. Clarke, the issue was the constitutionality of a statute that gave the president the power to impose a tariff on imported goods where he determined that the exporting country was not playing fair. Congress could make the same declaration with respect to, say, Nation X by passing legislation. And in deliberation whether to adjust the rate and how, different Congresspeople might have different views about whether, for example, Nation X's tariff on our exported widgets was reciprocally unequal to our tariff on their exported Hoosits. What if, for example, citizens in some states really need cheap Hoosits, and citizens of the widget exporting states have plenty of other markets other than Nation X? But the statute at issue in Field v. Clarke delegated to the president the power to make that judgment. And deciding what was and wasn't reciprocally unequal had the hallmarks of a legislative judgment, rather than a judgment as to whether some event had taken place or not. Nonetheless, the court upheld the statute. No legislative power had been delegated, despite what might appear. Another case in this line is Hampton v. United States. Here, Congress gave the president the power to tinker with tariff rates to equalize cost of production. Hey, tariffs are terrific. Congress itself might do that, but costs are constantly in flux. A drought or a change in the cost of some factor of production or currency fluctuation could affect the cost of producing widgets at any moment. How much more efficient to let the president do it through a subordinate official? As the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek observed, bureaucracy makes the laws because the representative assemblies have not the time to do so. The so-called necessary and proper clause of Article 1 seems to authorize Congress to delegate tasks of all kinds to other branches. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. Necessary and proper. If Congress decides it is both necessary and proper to let the president or some agency decide whether there are to be tariffs and at what rates, and on what goods, and so on, why should that be deemed illegal to do? The federal judiciary is not elected. The so-called non-delegation or anti-delegation doctrine holds that the legislative power in Congress is never transferable or delegable, no matter how efficient it would be, and no matter that Congress could always revoke any delegation it came to regret. But where in the Constitution does it say that? It doesn't. But it is implicit, some say, invoking the wisdom of English philosopher John Locke. The legislative power being derived from the people can be no other than that what that positive grant conveyed, which being only to make laws and not to make legislators, the legislature can have no power to transfer. Only to make laws and not to make legislators. Well, how does Locke know this about the people's will? Locke invokes ancient authority, the Roman maxim delegatus non potest delegare, which roughly translated means delegates can't delegate. Well, delegates can delegate if, but only if, the original power holder explicitly said so. Think of this example. You have complete and final authority over what goes into your body, but you might transfer some of this authority to your neurosurgeon to stick a needle into your spine. If you do that, you might be resentful to find out, when you come out of anesthesia, that the needle was in fact stuck in by a medical student or a nurse. The neurosurgeon, your delegate, delegated. But this happens all the time. Sometimes there is explicit consent, and sometimes consent is implied. But the cases are very clear that Congress is unable validly to delegate its power.